to Erased But Not Gone, a place where we uncover the forgotten stories of history, the stories hidden in the shadows of the past, stories many people were never taught in school, stories that reveal the painful truths and the silent struggles of those who lived through some of the darkest chapters of human history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. We love seeing how far our community reaches across the world. And if you enjoy learning about hidden history and forgotten stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light. Now let's dive into our story for today. The Nights When Visitors Came. In the quiet countryside of the American South, long before electricity lit the night skies and before modern roads cut through the land, large plantations stood like small kingdoms surrounded by endless fields of cotton and tobacco. From the outside, these plantations appeared calm and peaceful. The large white plantation houses sat proudly on hills or open land, their tall columns shining under the sun during the day and casting long shadows at night. Visitors who arrived during the afternoon often saw servants moving quickly across the yard, preparing meals, cleaning rooms, and carrying water. Everything looked orderly, controlled, and quiet. But when the sun disappeared and darkness spread across the land, a different world emerged inside those plantation houses. A world many people never saw. A world that the enslaved people who lived there could never escape. For enslaved women who worked inside the plantation house as maids, cooks, or servants, night often brought a deep sense of fear. The daytime work was exhausting, but predictable. They cleaned floors, washed clothes, served food, and obeyed orders. But nighttime was different. Nighttime meant uncertainty. Sometimes the sound that brought the most fear was the sound of horses approaching the house, the rumbling of carriage wheels on the dirt road, and the voices of unfamiliar men laughing as they stepped down from their carriages. Visitors had arrived. On many plantations, the arrival of guests meant celebration for the plantation owner. It meant long dinners, drinking, gambling, and loud conversations that continued late into the night. But for many enslaved women inside the house, it meant something far darker. One woman who later revealed this hidden truth was a young, enslaved woman who would grow up to become a writer whose words would travel across the world. Her name was Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in the early 1800s in North Carolina. As a child, she did not fully understand what slavery meant. She lived in the house of her enslavers and learned to sew, clean, and serve. Like many children born into slavery, she believed her world was normal because she had never known anything else. But as she grew older, she began to understand the harsh truth about the system that controlled her life. She saw how enslaved women inside the house were constantly watched, controlled, and threatened. And she began to notice something else, something that filled many women in the house with quiet dread. The nights when visitors came. Harriet later wrote about these experiences in her famous book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Her story became one of the most important personal accounts of slavery ever written because she spoke openly about things many people were afraid to talk about. She explained that when wealthy men or neighboring plantation owners visited the house, the atmosphere inside the building would change completely. The master of the plantation would be in a good mood. Food would be prepared in large amounts. Bottles of alcohol would appear on the dining table. Laughter echoed through the halls as the men talked about business, politics, and land. But behind the kitchen doors and along the quiet hallways of the house, enslaved women whispered to each other because they knew what sometimes followed those long dinners. Harriet remembered seeing young, enslaved women suddenly ordered to remain close to the guest rooms after the evening meals were finished. The orders were simple. Bring wine to the guests. Bring water. Stay nearby in case they call for something. Those words sounded innocent enough to anyone who did not understand the deeper meaning behind them. But enslaved women understood exactly what those orders could mean. Sometimes the young women sent to those rooms would return late into the night. Sometimes they returned early in the morning, their faces quiet, their eyes filled with shame or exhaustion. And sometimes they did not speak about what had happened at all. Harriet Jacobs later explained that enslaved women feared those nights more than the physical punishments that were common on plantations. A whipping might leave scars on the body, but the humiliation and helplessness of those nights left wounds that were harder to see. The women had no legal protection. They could not refuse, they could not complain, and they could not run. The law during slavery treated enslaved people as property. That meant their owners controlled every part of their lives, including their bodies. For young housemaids, the fear often began hours before the visitors even arrived. If word spread through the plantation that guests were coming, the enslaved women working in the house would grow tense. They cleaned the rooms carefully, prepared the beds, set the tables, and silently wondered which of them might be called later that night. Some older enslaved women tried to protect the younger girls. They gave quiet advice in the kitchen while preparing food. Stay near the other servants. Avoid being alone in the hallway. Do not attract attention. But even with those warnings, there was little anyone could do. The plantation owner made the decisions, and his orders were final. Harriet Jacobs also described how some enslavers used threats to control the women. If a woman resisted or tried to refuse orders, she could be punished severely. Some were whipped. Some were sold to harsher plantations further south. And for many enslaved people, being sold was one of the greatest fears of all. Because being sold meant being separated from family forever. Mothers were separated from children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. The possibility of losing everything they loved forced many enslaved women to remain silent and endure what they could not stop. But Harriet Jacobs was not the only person who later spoke about these hidden events. Many years later, long after slavery had ended, researchers began traveling across the United States to record the memories of elderly men and women who had once been enslaved. These interviews became part of what is known as the Federal Writers Project slave narratives. During the 1930s, interviewers sat down with hundreds of former slaves who were now very old. Some were in their 70s. Others were in their 80s or even 90s. Their voices were fragile with age, but their memories remained powerful. Many of them spoke about things they had witnessed inside plantation houses, stories that had remained hidden for decades. One elderly woman from Louisiana told interviewers about a young housemaid who worked in the large plantation home where she had lived as a child. The girl was known for being quiet and hardworking. She cleaned the upstairs rooms and helped serve dinner when visitors arrived. Whenever important businessmen came to stay at the plantation house, the girl was ordered to bring wine and candles to their rooms late in the evening. At first, the older enslaved workers thought it was simply part of her duties, but over time they noticed something that troubled them deeply. Each time the visitors stayed overnight, the girl returned to the servant quarters long after midnight. And when she came back, she often cried quietly while sitting alone. She never explained what had happened, but everyone understood, and no one dared to speak about it openly. Years later, the elderly woman who shared this story said that the memory still haunted her even though decades had passed since slavery ended. She remembered the girl's silent tears. She remembered the fear that spread through the servants' quarters whenever visitors arrived, and she remembered how powerless they all felt. Because on a plantation, the enslaved people lived under a system where resistance could bring terrible consequences. The plantation owners controlled the land, the homes, the food, and the law, and the enslaved people had almost no protection at all. But the stories did not end in Louisiana. Across the southern states, from Virginia to Mississippi, from Georgia to South Carolina, similar memories were later recorded. Different plantations, different owners, but the same dark pattern repeated again and again. Behind the bright lights of plantation dinners and the laughter of wealthy guests, enslaved women faced a hidden terror that history books rarely described, and as we will soon discover, some plantations turned these nights into something even more disturbing. Because in certain places, these events were not rare accidents. They became a planned tradition, a twisted form of hospitality that would haunt the lives of many enslaved women. And one of the places where this dark tradition took hold was a plantation in Virginia where gambling, drinking, and visiting slave owners created nights that the enslaved workers would never forget. That is where our story continues. In the next chapter, we will uncover what happened during the long gambling nights of Virginia plantations, where enslaved women were treated as part of the entertainment for powerful men who believed they owned everything around them, including the lives of other human beings. The Gambling Nights of Virginia. In the rolling countryside of Virginia, where wide rivers cut through green fields and tall oak trees lined the dusty plantation roads, there stood a plantation house known among neighboring landowners as a place of gathering. During the day, the house looked like many others across the South. A large wooden building painted white, wide porches, tall windows, and a view over hundreds of acres of farmland worked by enslaved people from sunrise until nightfall. Travelers passing by might have believed it was simply the home of a wealthy farmer living a comfortable life. But those who lived on the plantation knew the truth. They knew that when certain nights arrived, the house became a place of loud laughter, heavy drinking, and long hours of gambling that stretched deep into the darkness. For the plantation owner and his friends, these gatherings were entertainment. For the enslaved people forced to serve them, these nights were something entirely different. They were nights filled with fear, tension, and quiet suffering. The events usually began in the late afternoon. A cloud of dust would appear along the long dirt road leading to the plantation house. Soon the sound of horses and carriage wheels could be heard echoing across the fields. Enslaved workers in the yard would look up from their tasks and immediately understand what was happening. Guests were arriving. Inside the house, the kitchen would suddenly come alive with activity. The enslaved cooks rushed to prepare large meals. Chickens were slaughtered, vegetables chopped, and bread baked quickly in the ovens. The smell of roasted meat and spices filled the air. The plantation owner wanted his guests to be impressed. Large wooden tables were prepared in the dining room. Bottles of whiskey and rum were brought out from storage. Cards were placed neatly on a side table, where the men would soon gather to gamble for money, land, and sometimes even enslaved people. But while the men prepared for an evening of entertainment, the enslaved workers prepared for something else entirely. Among them were the housemaids. Most of these women were young, some were teenagers. A few were older women who had spent many years working inside the plantation house. They cleaned the rooms, carried food, washed clothes, and obeyed every order given by the master or his family. On gambling nights, their work became even more demanding. They moved quietly through the dining room, serving plates of food and filling glasses with alcohol as the men laughed loudly and shouted over their card games. The men often ignored the presence of the enslaved women moving around them. To them, these women were not people with feelings or fears. They were simply part of the household, like furniture or tools. But the enslaved women noticed everything. They noticed how the drinking became heavier, as the night grew darker. They noticed how the men's voices grew louder and more careless. And they knew that when the gambling tables were finally cleared, another part of the night would begin. One former enslaved man later spoke about these nights when he was interviewed many years after slavery ended. His memories were recorded as part of the Federal Writers Project Slave Narratives. By the time he shared his story, he was an old man. His hair had turned white, and his voice had grown soft with age. But the memories of the plantation, where he had grown up, were still clear in his mind. He remembered the gambling nights better than anything else. He said that when neighboring slave owners came to visit, they stayed long after midnight playing cards and drinking whiskey. The enslaved workers in the kitchen could hear their laughter through the walls. Sometimes they heard angry shouting when someone lost a large bet. But the enslaved workers also knew what often happened after the games ended. When the men had finished their cards and emptied their bottles, the plantation owner sometimes gave quiet instructions to the house servants. Those instructions were never spoken loudly. They were given calmly, almost casually. Send one of the girls to the guest rooms. Make sure the guests are comfortable. The words sounded polite. But everyone inside the servant quarters understood what they meant. The housemaids chosen for these tasks had no choice. They were ordered to bring candles, water, or fresh blankets to the rooms where the visiting men were staying. Sometimes they were told to remain nearby in case the guests needed something. Other times the orders were even more direct. Stay there until morning. For the enslaved women, these commands carried a weight of fear that was difficult to describe. Refusing an order from the plantation owner was almost impossible. Punishment could come quickly and severely. A woman who resisted might be whipped, or worse. She might be sold. Being sold was a nightmare for enslaved people. It meant being taken away from the plantation where they had lived for years. It meant being separated from family members who might never be seen again. Children were sold away from mothers. Husbands were separated from wives. Parents were forced to watch their sons and daughters taken away in chains. Because of this fear, many enslaved women endured these nights in silence. They obeyed the orders given to them. They walked slowly down the dark hallways of the plantation house, carrying candles that flickered against the wooden walls, and they stepped into guest rooms where powerful men waited behind closed doors. The old man who told this story said he remembered seeing the housemaids return early in the morning. Sometimes they walked slowly across the yard toward the servant quarters just as the sun began to rise. Their faces were quiet. Their eyes looked tired. And none of them spoke about what had happened during the night. But the other enslaved workers understood. One of the most painful parts of these memories was the helplessness everyone felt. The enslaved people cared about each other deeply. They shared food when someone was hungry. They helped each other through illness and exhaustion. But when it came to the power of the plantation owner and his guests, there was little they could do. The system of slavery was designed to keep them powerless. Even speaking openly about these events could lead to punishment. So many of the enslaved workers carried these stories quietly inside their hearts for years. Years later, when slavery finally ended and the chains of bondage were broken, some of them began sharing their memories with historians and interviewers. Those memories revealed something that many official records of slavery never mentioned. The plantation houses were not only places where enslaved people worked. They were also places where many enslaved women lived under constant threat of exploitation. And the gambling nights of Virginia were only one example. Across the southern states, similar gatherings took place. Some plantations held drinking parties. Others hosted large dinners for traveling businessmen. And on certain plantations, the overseers themselves organized weekend celebrations that brought together groups of powerful men. One of the most disturbing examples of this happened on a large plantation in Mississippi. There, the overseer, the man responsible for controlling the enslaved workers and enforcing the rules of the plantation, began hosting his own private gatherings. These events were even more dangerous for the enslaved women who worked inside the house, because the overseer had a reputation for cruelty. And when his parties began, the enslaved workers knew the night would bring trouble. The cooks prepared food while trying not to listen to the loud voices of the men gathering in the main house. The housemaids moved quietly through the rooms, hoping they would not be noticed. But on those nights, hope was often not enough, because once the drinking began and the overseer's friends filled the house with laughter and shouting, the orders would come again. "Send the girls. Make sure the guests are satisfied." And the young women chosen for these tasks would once again face a night they could not escape. In the next chapter, we will travel to Mississippi to uncover what happened during those overseer parties, where the power of one man created a terrifying atmosphere that the enslaved workers would remember for the rest of their lives. The overseers' parties in Mississippi. Far to the west of Virginia, across forests, rivers, and dusty wagon roads, the land of Mississippi stretched wide under the heavy southern sun. By the early 1800s, this region had become one of the largest centers of cotton plantations in the United States. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing cotton, and plantation owners rushed to claim as much land as possible. Large estates appeared quickly across the countryside, each one depending on the labor of enslaved men and women, forced to work from sunrise until long after the sun disappeared. But on one of these plantations, something unusual had begun to happen. Unlike many plantations where the owner controlled most events, this plantation was largely managed by an overseer. The owner lived far away in another state and only visited occasionally. Because of this distance, the overseer held enormous power over everyone on the plantation. His job was to make sure the cotton fields produced profit. He controlled the work schedules, the punishments, and the daily lives of the enslaved people who worked the land. Many overseers in the South were known for being strict, but this man had gained a reputation for something worse: cruelty. The enslaved workers feared him more than anyone else on the plantation. They had seen how quickly his temper could rise and how little mercy he showed when someone made a mistake in the fields. A man who picked too little cotton might be whipped. A woman who collapsed from exhaustion could be beaten for slowing the work. Even children sometimes faced punishment if they did not move fast enough. But the fear of the overseer did not end with the daytime work, because when the weekends arrived, something else began to happen. The overseers started hosting gatherings. At first, these events seemed simple. A few neighboring plantation managers would ride in on horseback. They would drink whiskey, eat food prepared by the enslaved cooks, and talk loudly on the porch of the plantation house. But as time passed, the gatherings grew larger. More men began arriving. Some were overseers from other plantations. Some were traders traveling through the region. Others were plantation owners visiting from nearby counties. The enslaved workers soon learned that when these men arrived together, the night would become long and dangerous. The preparations always began early in the evening. In the kitchen, enslaved cooks worked over hot fires preparing large meals. Pots of stew bubbled over open flames while bread baked in iron ovens. The smell of food drifted through the yard, mixing with the sound of laughter coming from the house. The overseer and his guests drank heavily. Their voices carried across the plantation yard as the sky slowly darkened. The enslaved people, working outside, knew the sound well. It was the sound of men who believed they had complete power over everything around them. But inside the servant quarters, another kind of conversation took place. Whispers. The enslaved women who worked inside the plantation house gathered quietly together while they finished their chores. They had seen these gatherings before. They knew what sometimes happened after the drinking began. One former enslaved cook later told interviewers about these nights many decades after slavery ended. By the time she spoke about her memories, she was already an elderly woman with deep lines on her face and hands worn from a lifetime of labor. But the memories of the overseer's parties remained sharp in her mind. She explained that the overseer would begin drinking early in the evening with his guests. The men laughed loudly and shouted stories across the dining room, while the enslaved servants moved silently around them, carrying plates and refilling glasses. As the night grew darker, the overseer often became more reckless. His voice grew louder. His movements became slower from the alcohol. And eventually he began giving orders. Those orders often involved the young enslaved women working inside the house. According to the cook's testimony, the overseer sometimes told the house servants to send certain women into the rooms where the visiting men were staying. He did not hide these instructions. He spoke them openly. "Send the girls. Make sure our guests are comfortable tonight." The cook remembered how the young women reacted when those words were spoken. Some of them froze in place for a moment. Others lowered their eyes to the floor. None of them spoke, because they knew that speaking could make things worse. The overseer had complete authority over the enslaved people on that plantation. If someone refused his orders, he could punish them severely, and his punishments were known to be harsh. The cook said she remembered watching one young woman in particular. The girl had arrived on the plantation only a few years earlier after being sold from another estate further east. She was quiet and hardworking, and many of the older enslaved women had tried to protect her as best they could. But protection was difficult under slavery. One evening during one of the overseer's parties, the girl was ordered to bring candles and water to the guest rooms. The cook saw her walking slowly across the hallway, carrying a small tray with trembling hands. The cook wanted to say something to comfort her, but there were no words that could change what was about to happen. The girl disappeared down the hallway and closed the door behind her. Hours passed. The party continued in the dining room where the men drank and laughed. Finally, the house grew quiet. The guests went to sleep, and the girl returned to the servant quarters just before sunrise. The cook remembered that she looked exhausted. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying. But she did not say a single word about the night. She simply lay down on her small bed and closed her eyes. Later that same morning, she was back in the kitchen, helping prepare breakfast for the very men who had caused her suffering. The cook said that moments like this were some of the hardest memories she carried from her years in slavery, because everyone could see what was happening. But no one had the power to stop it. On that plantation, the overseer continued hosting these gatherings for years. The enslaved workers learned to recognize the early signs: the sound of horses approaching, the loud voices of men arriving at the house, the smell of alcohol drifting from the dining room. Each of these signs meant the same thing: another long night was beginning. But even within this harsh world, enslaved people tried to support each other in small ways. Older women sometimes volunteered to take certain tasks instead of younger girls when they could. Friends waited awake in the servant quarters until the women returned from the guest rooms. Sometimes they offered quiet comfort, sharing food or simply sitting beside each other in silence. These small acts of kindness became a way for enslaved people to survive the cruelty surrounding them. Yet the stories from Mississippi were not the only ones recorded by historians. Across the South, other plantations developed their own disturbing traditions. In South Carolina, on a large rice plantation surrounded by wetlands and tall grass, enslaved workers spoke of a room that became known by a haunting name. They called it the guest room of sorrow. It was a room near the front of the plantation house where visiting men often stayed overnight. And for the enslaved women who were ordered to enter that room, the nights that followed became memories they would carry for the rest of their lives. In the next chapter, we will travel to that South Carolina plantation and uncover the story behind the room that enslaved workers never forgot, a place where silence, fear, and power collided behind a single closed door. The guest room of sorrow in South Carolina. Along the low coastal lands of South Carolina, where wide rice fields stretched across flat wetlands, and the air often carried the smell of river water and marsh grass, there stood a plantation that had gained wealth from the labor of enslaved people who worked in the rice fields from dawn until darkness. The plantation house stood slightly higher than the surrounding land so that floods from the nearby rivers would not reach it. From a distance, the house appeared grand and peaceful, surrounded by tall oak trees whose branches hung heavy with Spanish moss. Visitors traveling along the river sometimes admired the sight, believing it to be a place of comfort and prosperity. But for the enslaved people who lived and worked on that land, the plantation house held memories that were far from peaceful. Inside the house, there was a room near the front hallway that the enslaved workers spoke about in quiet whispers. It was not the largest room in the building, and it was not the most beautiful. But it held a reputation that spread throughout the quarters where the enslaved people lived. They called it the guest room of sorrow. The name was never spoken loudly. It passed from one worker to another through quiet conversation after the long workdays ended. New arrivals to the plantation soon learned about it from older workers who had seen many seasons pass on the estate. The room was used whenever visitors came to stay overnight. Traveling businessmen sometimes stayed there. Plantation owners from neighboring estates also used the room when they visited for dinners or business meetings. Doctors traveling through the region occasionally rested there during long journeys between plantations. For the plantation owner, the guest room was simply a place of hospitality. But for the enslaved women who worked inside the house, the room represented something far darker. One former enslaved man later described the atmosphere surrounding that room when he was interviewed many years after slavery ended. By the time he shared his story, he was already an elderly man whose voice carried the weight of many memories. He explained that certain housemaids on the plantation were ordered to sleep in small rooms close to the guest quarters whenever visitors arrived. The arrangement was presented as a matter of convenience. If the guest needed water or candles during the night, the servants would be nearby to help. But everyone living on the plantation knew the deeper truth. The enslaved women assigned to those rooms were often sent into the guest room of sorrow after the plantation house grew quiet. The man who told this story remembered watching the routine unfold many times when he was a young boy living on the plantation. He said the pattern was always the same. The visitors would arrive during the afternoon or early evening. Horses and carriages lined the front yard while enslaved workers hurried to carry luggage inside. The cooks prepared large meals in the kitchen. The housemaids cleaned the guest room carefully, placing fresh blankets on the bed and lighting candles along the walls. The plantation owner greeted his guests warmly and invited them to dine in the large dining room where bottles of wine and whiskey were placed on the table. Laughter and conversation filled the house for hours. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers moved quietly through the hallways, performing their duties, while avoiding drawing attention to themselves. As the night grew deeper, the dinner ended, and the guests prepared to sleep. That was when the instructions often came. The plantation owner would speak quietly to one of the house servants. Send one of the girls to the guest room. Make sure our visitor is comfortable tonight. The words were spoken in a calm voice, as if the order were no different from asking someone to bring water or light a candle. But the enslaved people who heard those instructions felt a chill run through them. They understood what the command meant. The young women chosen for this task rarely had any warning. Sometimes they were called suddenly while finishing their evening chores. Other times they were told earlier in the evening that they would be needed later that night. The man who shared this story said he remembered seeing the expressions on their faces when they realized they had been chosen. Some tried to remain calm, others looked frightened but stayed silent, because refusing an order from the plantation owner could lead to punishment. And punishment on that plantation could be severe. The enslaved workers had seen people whipped for smaller acts of disobedience. They had seen families separated when someone was sold away to another plantation. Fear kept many people silent. Once the order was given, the young woman would walk slowly toward the guest room. The hallway leading to that room was dimly lit by candlelight. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath each step. Behind the closed doors of the house, most of the other servants waited quietly, listening to the faint sounds of movement along the hallway. Sometimes they prayed silently. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, hoping the night would pass quickly. The man who told this story said that over time the enslaved workers began calling the room the guest room of sorrow because of the sadness connected to it. Too many young women had been sent through that door. Too many had returned with tired eyes and heavy hearts. Yet life on the plantation continued as if nothing had happened. When morning arrived, the same women were expected to rise early and begin their daily work again. They cleaned the floors, prepared breakfast, served the very guests who had occupied that room during the night, and the cycle repeated whenever new visitors arrived. One elderly woman, who had once worked as a housemaid on the plantation, later shared her own memory of the guest room of sorrow. She said that when she first arrived at the plantation as a young girl, she did not understand why the older women looked worried whenever visitors came to stay. But one evening, an older servant quietly explained the truth to her. The older woman warned her to avoid attracting attention whenever guests visited. "Stay close to the kitchen," she said softly. "Do your work quickly and keep your head down." The young girl listened carefully but still did not fully understand. Then one night, she saw a young housemaid sent toward the guest room after dinner. The girl walked slowly down the hallway, carrying a candle. The door closed behind her. Hours later, she returned looking exhausted. The next morning, she spoke very little while working. That was when the young girl finally understood why the older servants had looked so worried. Years later, after slavery ended, the woman said that memory stayed with her. She remembered the silence surrounding that room. She remembered the quiet tears she sometimes saw in the eyes of the women who had been sent there. And she remembered the feeling of helplessness that filled the quarters whenever visitors arrived. Because on that plantation, the power of the owner and his guests seemed impossible to challenge. Yet the stories of enslaved women facing exploitation did not end in South Carolina. Further west in Georgia, another woman would later tell a story that revealed how appearances and beauty sometimes placed enslaved women in even greater danger. She had once been chosen to work inside a plantation house, not because of her skills, but because of the way she looked. At first she believed it was a blessing. Working inside the house meant she would not have to spend long days in the cotton fields, but she soon discovered that the house carried its own hidden dangers, because her enslaver often invited neighboring planters for dinner. And when those dinners ended, the same order was given again. Send the girl to the guest room. In the next chapter, we will uncover the story of the Georgia auction survivor and the difficult path her life took after being chosen to work inside the plantation house, where beauty became both a privilege and a curse. The Georgia auction survivor. In the state of Georgia, where long rows of cotton stretched across the countryside like white waves under the hot southern sun, many plantations depended heavily on the labor of enslaved men and women. The work in the fields was harsh. From early morning until late evening, enslaved workers bent over cotton plants, picking fiber by hand while overseers watched closely to make sure no one slowed down. For many enslaved people, the cotton fields represented the hardest form of labor on the plantation. The heat was relentless. The work never seemed to end, and punishment often followed anyone who failed to meet the daily quota of cotton required by the overseer. Because of this, many enslaved people believed that working inside the plantation house might offer a slightly easier life. House servants still worked long hours, but they were protected from the burning sun and the endless rows of cotton fields. Yet the truth was more complicated. For some enslaved women, being chosen to work inside the plantation house brought dangers that were just as frightening as the hardships of the fields. One woman, who later told her story, had been sold at a slave auction in Georgia when she was still a young girl. She remembered that day clearly even many years later. The auction yard had been crowded with buyers who walked slowly among the enslaved people, lined up for inspection. Some buyers examined the workers as if they were livestock, checking their teeth, muscles, and hands to judge their strength. Children stood beside their parents, uncertain about what would happen next. Some families clung to each other, hoping they would not be separated, but hope rarely changed the outcome of those sales. The young girl who would later share this story was separated from her mother during the auction. A wealthy plantation owner purchased her and brought her to his estate several miles away. When she arrived, she expected to be sent to the cotton fields like most of the other young girls on the plantation. But the owner had other plans. After observing her for several days, he decided she would work inside the plantation house as a maid. At first, she believed this decision had saved her from the exhausting work in the fields. She helped clean the rooms, carried water, and assisted the cook in the kitchen. The tasks were difficult but manageable. The older house servants sometimes showed her how to complete certain chores quickly so she would not be scolded by the mistress of the house. For a short time, she believed she had been fortunate. But slowly, she began noticing something troubling. The plantation owner often invited neighboring planters to visit his home. Sometimes the visits were for business discussions about crops and land. Other times the gatherings were simply social events, where wealthy men ate large meals and drank together late into the evening. During those dinners, the young maid was often ordered to help serve food at the table. She moved carefully between the chairs, carrying plates and glasses while trying not to draw attention to herself. But she soon realized that several of the visiting men watched her closely as she worked. At first, she tried to ignore their glances. She kept her eyes lowered and focused on her tasks. Yet the attention continued during each visit. One evening after a long dinner, the plantation owner gave an instruction that changed the course of her life. He called her into the hallway after the guests had finished eating. His voice sounded calm as he spoke. "Take a candle and go to the guest room. Our visitor may need something during the night." The young maid felt a sudden wave of fear. She had heard quiet rumors among the other house servants about similar orders given to certain women on the plantation. But until that moment, she had hoped those stories were not true. Still, she had no power to refuse. She picked up a candle and walked slowly down the hallway towards the guest room. The wooden floor creaked beneath her steps. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest. Behind her, the voices of the men in the dining room faded as she approached the door. She knocked softly before entering. That night became the beginning of a pattern that repeated many times over the following years. Whenever important guests stayed at the plantation house, the owner sometimes sent the young maid to their rooms. The orders were always delivered calmly. Bring water, bring blankets, make sure the guest is comfortable. But she knew what those instructions often meant. She endured these nights in silence because she feared the consequences of resistance. Like many enslaved people, she had already seen the terrible impact of being sold. Workers who angered the plantation owner were sometimes sent away to harsher plantations further south. Families were torn apart without warning. The young maid feared that if she disobeyed, she might be sold again and never see the friends she had made on the plantation. Years passed under this painful routine. Then one day, something happened that changed her situation once again. She became pregnant. On many plantations, enslaved women who became pregnant faced difficult circumstances. Some owners forced them to return to work soon after giving birth. Others sold them if they believed the pregnancy would reduce their productivity. In this case, the plantation owner decided to sell the young woman at another auction. The decision came suddenly. Within days, she was placed on a wagon and transported to a nearby town where buyers gathered regularly to purchase enslaved workers. Standing once again in an auction yard, she felt the same fear she had experienced years earlier when she was separated from her mother. She did not know who would purchase her next. She did not know where she would be taken, but she understood that her life would once again change completely. Years later, after slavery had ended, she shared her memories with people who were collecting stories from former enslaved individuals. Her voice trembled as she described the nights she had spent serving the plantation owner's guests. She explained that the experience had left deep emotional scars that remained long after she gained her freedom. But her story was not unique. Across the southern states, many enslaved women faced similar exploitation within plantation houses. Traveling doctors, businessmen, and river traders often moved from plantation to plantation during their journeys. And when these visitors stayed overnight, some plantation owners treated the enslaved women in their households as part of their hospitality. One such story came from an Alabama plantation where a traveling doctor visited frequently during the growing season. Each time his carriage approached the house, one young maid on the plantation felt a deep sense of dread, because she knew what the plantation owner might order her to do once the doctor arrived. In the next chapter, we will uncover the troubling story of the plantation doctor's visits and the fear that spread through the servant quarters whenever his carriage appeared on the long road leading to the plantation house. The doctor who returned. In the countryside of Alabama, where long dirt roads cut through pine forests and wide cotton fields, plantations stood miles apart from one another. Travel between them often took hours by horse or wagon. Because of this distance, plantation owners depended on traveling professionals who moved from estate to estate offering services. Among the most common visitors were doctors. Plantation owners relied on these doctors to treat illnesses, injuries, and diseases that spread among both the enslaved workers and the families living in the plantation houses. A doctor might ride for hours or even days visiting multiple plantations before returning home. To many plantation owners, these doctors were respected guests. But on one plantation in Alabama, the arrival of a particular doctor became a source of fear among the enslaved people who lived there. The plantation itself was large, surrounded by hundreds of acres of cotton fields. The plantation house stood on a gentle hill overlooking the land, with a long road that stretched from the main gate all the way to the front porch. From the fields and the servant quarters, it was easy to see anyone approaching the house. And that was how the enslaved workers always knew when the doctor was coming. His carriage was distinctive. The wheels were large and painted dark. 2 horses pulled the wagon steadily along the road. Whenever the carriage appeared in the distance, word quickly spread through the plantation. The doctor's coming. For most people on the plantation, the news meant that someone might be ill or injured. The doctor would examine patients, prepare medicines, and speak with the plantation owner about health concerns. But for one young enslaved maid working inside the house, the sight of that carriage filled her with dread. Her story was later recorded in the memoirs shared by other former enslaved workers who had lived on the same plant. The young woman had been working inside the house for several years. She cleaned rooms, carried water, and helped prepare meals for the owner's family. Like many housemaids, she worked quietly and tried to avoid drawing attention to herself. But the plantation owner had noticed her, and so had the visiting doctor. During the doctor's first visit to the plantation, the young maid was assigned to bring water and towels to the room where he stayed overnight. It seemed like a normal task for a house servant. But when the doctor returned again a few weeks later, the same order was given. Send the girl with the water. After several visits, the pattern became clear. Each time the doctor arrived, the plantation owner instructed the maid to attend to him during the night. The orders were given in a calm and ordinary tone. Bring candles to the guest room. Make sure the doctor has everything he needs. But the servants who worked inside the house understood what those instructions meant. The young maid understood as well, and with each visit, the fear inside her grew stronger. One of the older enslaved women who worked in the kitchen later described how the girl reacted whenever the doctor's carriage appeared on the road. She would grow quiet. Her hands sometimes trembled as she prepared trays of food or water. The other servants noticed the change in her behavior but could offer little help. They lived under the same system of control and punishment. Refusing the orders of the plantation owner could lead to severe consequences. The cook who shared this memory said that one afternoon she watched the girl standing near the kitchen door when the doctor's carriage rolled into the yard. The moment she saw it, her shoulders dropped slightly, as if a heavy weight had settled upon her. The cook quietly placed a hand on the girl's arm in a small gesture of comfort. But there were no words that could change what would happen later that night. When evening came, the doctor joined the plantation owner for dinner. The table was filled with food and bottles of whiskey. Their conversation and laughter echoed through the house while the servants moved silently around them. As the night grew late, the plantation owner finally gave the instruction that everyone expected. Send the girl to the guest room. The young maid carried a candle and a small pitcher of water down the hallway toward the room where the doctor was staying. The light from the candle flickered against the walls as she walked. Behind her, the voices of the men faded, and the door of the guest room closed quietly. The older cook said that the servants waited in silence that night, just as they had done during the doctor's previous visits. They knew the girl would not return until morning. When she finally appeared in the kitchen early the next day, she looked exhausted, but said nothing about the night. She simply began preparing breakfast for the household. Over time, the doctor continued visiting the plantation regularly, and each visit followed the same pattern. The carriage arriving in the afternoon, dinner in the evening, and the quiet instruction given late at night. Send the girl. The repeated visits became a source of deep sadness among the servants. They cared about the young woman and wished they could protect her from the situation she faced. But slavery had created a world where their ability to intervene was almost non-existent. Years later, when slavery finally ended, many former enslaved people began sharing memories of the hidden realities that had existed within plantation houses. Stories like this one revealed how power had been abused in ways rarely recorded in official documents. The pain carried by those who lived through these experiences remained long after the chains of slavery were broken. Yet the doctor's visits were only one example among many. Further west, along the wide waters of the Arkansas River, another plantation had developed its own troubling pattern when traveling traders stopped there during their journeys. River traders moved goods along the waterways that connected many southern states. Cotton, timber, and other supplies were transported by boat between plantations and distant markets. These traders often stopped overnight at plantations located near the riverbanks, and when they did, the plantation owner sometimes ordered certain housemaids to accompany them to the small guest house built near the edge of the property. The enslaved workers who lived on that plantation remembered those nights clearly. They remembered the traders' boats tied along the river. They remembered the lanterns glowing inside the guest house. And they remembered the quiet footsteps of the women sent there after dark. In the final chapter of our story, we will travel to that Arkansas River plantation to uncover what happened when the river traders arrived, and how the memories of those nights remained with the enslaved workers for the rest of their lives. After that, we will reflect on why these hidden stories of slavery continue to matter today, and why remembering them is an important part of understanding history. The river traders and the long memory of the night. Along the wide waters of the Arkansas River, the land stretched flat and open for miles. The river itself moved slowly through the countryside like a long silver ribbon, carrying boats loaded with cotton, timber, and goods from plantation to plantation. In the days before railroads spread across the South, rivers were the main highways of trade. River traders traveled constantly, moving up and down the waterways while stopping at plantations to buy cotton, sell supplies, and arrange business deals with plantation owners. Near one bend of the Arkansas River stood a plantation that had grown wealthy because of this trade. Boats often stopped along the riverbank, and the plantation owner built a small guest house not far from the water where visiting traders could rest during their journeys. From a distance, the guest house looked simple. It was a wooden building with 2 small rooms and a porch facing the river. Lanterns hung along the wall so that travelers arriving late in the evening could easily find the entrance. For the traders who visited the plantation, the guest house was a convenient place to spend the night before continuing their journey. But for the enslaved people living on the plantation, the guest house became connected with memories that were difficult to forget. One of the enslaved workers who later spoke about these events was a cook who had spent many years preparing meals inside the plantation kitchen. By the time she shared her memories with interviewers many decades later, her voice had grown soft with age, but her recollections remained vivid. She explained that whenever river traders arrived at the plantation, the atmosphere quickly changed. Boats would appear along the riverbank during the late afternoon. Workers unloading cotton sometimes saw the vessels approaching from far away as they moved slowly along the water. Soon the traders stepped onto the land carrying bags, tools, and business papers. They usually walked toward the plantation house to greet the owner and discuss their trade. After the business conversations ended, the plantation owner often invited them to stay for dinner. The cooks prepared large meals in the kitchen, while the traders and the owner talked loudly about cotton prices and river travel. Inside the kitchen, the enslaved workers listened quietly while performing their tasks. They knew what sometimes happened after these dinners, when the evening grew late and the traders prepared to sleep in the guest house near the river. The plantation owner sometimes gave instructions that filled the servants with dread. He would turn toward the house servants and speak calmly. "Send 2 of the girls to the guest house. Make sure the traders are comfortable tonight." The words were delivered casually, as if he were asking someone to bring extra blankets or candles. But the servants understood what the order meant. The young housemaids chosen for this task rarely spoke when their names were called. They simply lowered their eyes and obeyed. Refusing such an order could bring punishment. The plantation owner had the authority to whip workers or sell them away to distant plantations. Fear kept many people silent. The cook remembered watching the young women walk down the path toward the river carrying small lanterns that flickered in the darkness. The path led through tall grass and trees before reaching the guest house near the water. From the plantation yard, the lantern lights looked like small glowing stars moving slowly through the night. Then the door of the guest house would close, and silence would settle over the riverbank. The cook said the servants often waited awake in the quarters, listening to the distant sounds of the river flowing past the plantation. Sometimes they whispered quiet prayers for the women who had been sent to the guest house. They knew those women would not return until morning. When dawn finally arrived, the young maids walked back along the same path toward the plantation house. The rising sun cast pale light across the fields as they returned to begin another day of work. Despite the exhaustion they felt, they were still expected to perform their duties as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. They swept floors, carried water, prepared food, served the very men who had occupied the guest house hours earlier. The cook explained that the hardest part was the silence surrounding these events. No one spoke openly about what had happened. The plantation owner never mentioned it again once the traders departed. Life simply continued as usual until the next group of travelers arrived along the river. Years passed on that plantation under the same pattern. Boats arriving, dinners being prepared, and the quiet order given late at night. Send the girls. When slavery finally ended after the Civil War, many enslaved people left the plantations where they had spent their lives. Some traveled long distances searching for lost family members. Others settled in nearby towns hoping to build new lives as free people. The cook who shared this story eventually moved to another community where she worked and raised a family. But even as the years passed, the memories of those nights by the Arkansas River remained with her. When interviewers from the Federal Writers Project spoke with her during the 1930s, she decided to share what she had witnessed. She believed it was important for people to understand the hidden realities of slavery, not only the hard labor in the fields, but also the suffering that took place behind the walls of plantation houses. Her testimony joined hundreds of other accounts recorded from former enslaved men and women who described the many ways their lives had been controlled by the system of slavery. Together, these stories created a clearer picture of the past. They revealed experiences that had rarely been written in official plantation records. They showed how power was used to exploit those who had no legal protection and no ability to refuse. And they reminded future generations that the history of slavery was far more complex and painful than many people once believed. Today, historians continue to study these narratives and memoirs to understand the full truth of that era. The voices of people like Harriet Jacobs and the many former enslaved individuals who shared their memories help us see history through the eyes of those who lived it. Their stories are not easy to hear, but they are important, because remembering the past allows us to learn from it. It reminds us of the value of human dignity, freedom, and justice. And it ensures that the suffering endured by countless enslaved people will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching this powerful and difficult chapter of history with us. The stories we shared today come from historical accounts, memoirs, and interviews with formerly enslaved people whose voices help us understand the hidden realities of slavery. If you found this story meaningful and educational, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering forgotten history and bringing these important stories to light. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. We always enjoy seeing our community from all around the world. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and remember that history always has more stories waiting to be discovered.